Hello everyone, how are you? Today I will walk you through my process of making this Hilda looking scene using Blender's Grease Pencil. I will post a full process video, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. First, I will show you how I made this night scene, how I turned it into a day scene, and how I made the final animation. Actually, this one is more of a sunset or sunrise scene. You could take a reference image with an actual sunny day scene from Hilda and use that color scheme instead. But I think the sunset scenes in this series have really nice colors, so that's why I chose that as my reference. At the end of the video, I will give you some tips on how to analyze a style so you can recreate it like I did here. To set my camera, I aligned my view to the -y axis, and then I set my camera to view. To make the sky, I will show you two ways. One is more perfect, as you can see, and the other one gives a more hand-drawing, imperfect look. The first way is by changing the world color. I added a texture coordinate node, a mapping node, and a color ramp node. I set my color ramp to constant and added 4 color stops, and I changed the values in the mapping node and in the color ramp node until I got the same shape as Hilda's sky. To sample the colors, I opened my reference images in an image editor. You could open the image in Blender as well and use the eyedropper tool to get the same colors. To get the second style of sky, I added a grease pencil object. Remember to be in frame 1 each time you make a new grease pencil object. I disabled use lights in all the grease pencil objects I created in this project. I made 4 materials, one for each sky color, and all these materials were fill materials. Before you start drawing, make sure you are in either camera view mode or in the viewpoint of your choice while you are drawing. In this case, I drew in camera view mode for the entire process, and then I just drew each stripe. You could use the box tool, but since I wanted a more imperfect look, I only used the pen tool. I perfected the lines a bit in sculpt mode. And here we have 2 ways of making the sky. For the moon, I added a new grease pencil object, and I made a fill material. And using the circle tool, I made a moon. You could use the pen tool instead and make a crescent moon too. To get the moon glow, I added 3 glow effects with these settings. The glow only shows in render preview mode, by the way. If your moon is bigger or smaller, you may need to tweak the settings in the glow effect. I made the stars in another grease pencil object, and with the stroke material, I drew dots using the draw tool. I made the smaller dots to add some variety. I changed the thickness in sculpt mode as well. And I added 2 glow effects. These were my final values. And in Hilda, the stars twinkle and move a bit, so I tried to achieve the same effect using a noise modifier. For the clouds, I added a new grease pencil object. I made 3 materials, a stroke material for the line art, a fill material for the overall color, and another fill material for the shading. I created 3 layers for each cloud. I got one of my clouds line art in the top layer, one of my clouds highlights in another layer, and the overall color in another layer. And then I have the same for the other cloud. And remember that the order of the layers matters. I drew the line art of one cloud in one layer, and the line art of the second cloud in another layer. I smooth the lines in sculpt mode, and I also used the grab tool to change the clouds a bit. In another layer, I filled one cloud using the bucket tool, and in another layer, I did the same for the second cloud. In another layer, I drew the light on the top part of the clouds to emulate the moonlight. And for this, enabling the mask option was really helpful to not draw outside the lines. You could also add some shadows, which I actually did for the mountain I'm about to show you. And I also smoothed the lines a bit. I placed the moon behind the clouds, since the line art in Hilda is thinner, I used the thickness tool to achieve that. I had to use the grab tool to fix the fill and the shading on the edges. Once my clouds were in the final position, I enabled automatic keyframes, and I moved the clouds Then, with all my layers unlocked, I interpolated the keyframes for each layer. And here it is. For the mountains, I added another grease pencil object. I sketched a mountain in one layer, and in a new layer I drew the line art using a stroked material. I tried to replicate Hilda's line art, leaving spaces between the lines. Got rid of the sketch layer. I smoothed the lines in sculpt mode, and I moved the strokes with the grab tool. And I made the lines thinner. For the mountain, I made 6 materials, one for the line art, a fill material for the overall color of the mountain, a fill material for the overall color of the snow, a fill material for the shadow of the snow, a fill material for the shadow of the mountain, and finally a fill material for the highlights. For the mountain, I used 4 layers, a fill layer, a shadow layer, a highlight layer, and a layer for the line art. I drew the fill for the mountain. I used the grab tool to perfect the placement of the fill. In the same layer, I drew the fill for the snow. I used the grab tool to perfect the placement of the fill. And just like I did the shading for the clouds, I did it for the mountains. except this time I drew both light and shadow. I added the shadows with masks enabled. I drew the shadows on one side and also below the snow. And then I added the highlights also with masks enabled. I drew the highlights on the opposite side of the shadows. And I smoothed all the layers. And I made the line art thinner. I moved the mountain forward the stars. And to make it into a day scene, I made a new full copy scene. First, I changed the colors in the color ramp. I used a reference image to get the same colors. To change the grease pencil sky, I had to make each material a single user copy, so the colors in the other scene wouldn't change. And I picked the colors from the word color. For the mountain, I also had to make a single user copy and change the colors one by one. And then I repeated the process for the clouds. I moved the grease pencil sky in both scenes. And after moving the sky, I had to move the sun and the moon in both scenes. And to turn the moon into a sun, I kept the same material, but I changed the glow's colors. And here we have the day and the night scene. I'm gonna show you the other sky, the one I made in the word color. Let me know which one you like best. I made the final animation in a new full copy scene. I scaled the clouds keyframe to slow down the animation. And after the clouds stopped moving, I added a location keyframe for the moon. I used the annotation tool to help me see the trajectory the moon will take. And then I made a couple of location keyframes. And I eased the keyframes. I spaced the keyframes a bit more. And then I copied the sun from the day scene. And I did the same, but this time from the opposite side. And the sun's last position is the moon's starting position. Before animating the colors, I went back to the night scene and made all the materials I was planning to animate a single user copy, otherwise they would be animated in all the scenes where those materials were used. To make the color changing animation, I simply made a keyframe for each color. I moved the playhead to another frame and then I copied the colors from the day scene and added another keyframe. I did the same for all my other Grease Pencil objects. To make the stars disappear, I made a color keyframe, and then I changed the color's alpha value to 0 and added a new keyframe. And for animating the world color, it's the same process. You make a color keyframe for each color in the color ramp. Move the playhead to another frame. Change each color and then add a new keyframe for each color. And then I added a new camera to have two different shots. I scale and move the clouds a bit, And of course, I copied the cloud's values to the other two scenes. And before rendering, remember to enable Combine and Seed Passes. And here we have the final animation. Okay, so now how to analyze and what things to look at when we're trying to replicate the look of an animation or illustration. I suggest you start with the elements of art, which are line, shape, form, color, texture, value, space. Let's take a line for example. Lines can vary in width, direction, and length. They can be straight or curved, thick or thin. In Hilda, for example, the lines for the characters are different than the ones for the backgrounds. They have different line weight, so the characters attract attention. The characters have a thicker outline, so they stand out, and also their outlines are black, unlike the background's line work, which sometimes is dark but other times has a lighter color. Also, in this series, the line work breaks up, as you can see. In addition, if you take a closer look, the character's line work has some texture, especially in the closer shots. When it comes to shape and form, Hilda has a lot of geometric shapes, especially rectangles and triangles for the houses, and they contrast with the organic, irregular shapes of the trees, mountains, and creatures. Analyzing the color in Hilda is pretty simple. The show uses a limited color palette, usually a complementary color scheme for most of the scenes, a monochrome color scheme for the night scenes, or an analogous color scheme for the sunset scenes. As you can see, these 7 categories overlap with each other. Another thing to look at is the shading. Is it simple or complex? Is it blended or not? Hilda uses simple shading shapes. The shapes of the shadows and of the highlights are easy to distinguish. I hope these tips were helpful. If you like to see the entire drawing and animation process, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. You can buy the blend file to support the channel. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one. Bye!